we're going to kick things off by talking about the impact of ambient light surround when we view content on mobile devices. I just watched a movie last night on a mobile device, and I had a light next onto my bed, and sure, it put a glare on the screen, so is that color being reproduced accurately? I don't know. But we have somebody here who has a little bit more insight into what that impact is of ambient light, and that is Trevor Canham from the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's going to talk about the influence of ambient chromaticity on portable display color appearance. His interests lie in digital image processing, color management, and the communication of technical ideas through writing and filmmaking. He recently received a BS degree from where else? RIT. It seems like we have a whole chapter devoted to that here. And he currently is living in Spain, working as a research institute at the Image Processing for Enhanced Cinematography at Universitat de Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Really good paella there. Got to get back and try that. He's continuing work on adaptive display color management by assisting in the development and implementation of color novel tone mapping algorithms for multiple European Research Council funded projects. But that's enough about Trevor. I'm going to have him come up now and tell you all about his research on the effect of ambient chromaticity on portable displays.
Thank you, Pete, for that kind introduction. So I'm going to be speaking today about the work I did over the past year at the Rochester Institute of Technology with Michael Murdoch and David Long on, like Pete said, the effect of ambient illumination chromaticity on the color appearance of images on mobile displays. So I hope this diagram spells it out pretty clearly. Obviously this is an exaggerated representation. You're not actually adapting to these two images for them to look different. Basically, the issue is mobile displays can be taken into a range of different environments in a short period of time, and the idea is that these different environments can influence the color appearance of the images on the displays in ways that we don't really understand. So we know that a lot of consumers are viewing content on these displays, and moving forward, more and more applications are being developed in which professionals are also, motion picture professionals are proofing content on these displays and using them for that purpose. So you might say, any motion picture professional worth their salt wouldn't try and proof an image on a mobile display, but these displays are getting better and better, and we could create systems, color management systems, that can improve things for them so that they could actually be viable tools for collaboration. And they're not a reference monitor, but if you won't do it for the consumers, at least do it for yourselves, I'd say. So how would we get these images to look the same, basically? The way I see it, the only way would be some sort of adaptive color management application, which takes in input either automatically using sensors on the device or input manually about the ambient conditions of the room, and the proper transforms would be executed to account for the color appearance phenomena. But before that could happen, first the color appearance phenomena that are important in the situation would need to be characterized. And among the possible effects, chromatic adaptation is one of the least well studied, which is the chosen topic of this research. So the specific, the color science specific definition is just accounting for chromatic adaptation to the surround and identifying that impact on these images. So the last time that this topic of research really came into prominence in the literature was in the early 90s, when using color image displays to work with images and make adjustments to images was becoming more and more popular. And people were obviously using these soft copy displays to make adjustments, proof images, so that they could be reproduced in hard copy and you wouldn't have to make a bunch of hard copies, basically. But there was one problem with this. Anyone who is familiar with color science knows that we perceive these two media quite differently. So the color science research community took great effort to sort of characterize as many color appearance phenomena that differed between viewing hard copy and soft copy images, and build models for these. So one of the most extensive pieces of literature that I found in my research that was very influential to this work was done by Mark E. Gorzinski on achromatic perception in color image displays. And Mark did a number of experiments in this research, but the most relevant to this talk is an experiment he did in which observers were presented with a series of achromatic patches which varied slightly in UV space along a single vector, and observers were just asked to select the patch which appeared most achromatic to them, or most neutral. So between trials, the display white point and the ambient white point were shifted, and the idea was just to see if observers preferred achromatic reference shifted in relation to that. And the data here shows on the, what would be your left, that the basically the ambient chromaticity in the viewing environment had no effect on observers' adapted states. There's two clusters of data which can only be clearly shown to be controlled by the display white point. So a few years later, Naoya Kato conducted an experiment on the effect of ambient light on the color appearance of soft copy images, and the subtitle there was Mixed Chromatic Adaptation for Self-Luminous Displays. So mixed chromatic adaptation is going in even further to the color science classifications. This is the main topic. So anyone who's not familiar with color science, I'll make it very, very simple. This is a very easy topic. So mixed adaptation is essentially when observers are encountering more than one achromatic white reference in a scene, and the idea is they're going to adapt to some weighting between those two achromatic reference points. And the question that researchers try to solve in this case is how to calculate that weighting. What factors influence the weighting between, say, like in the case that we're speaking about, an observer is adapted to the white point of a display partially, and possibly partially to the white point of the room around them. So how do we figure out how much they're adapted to one or the other, basically? So Kato's experiment was specifically for the task of soft copy, hard copy matching. And basically what was done was a series of images were presented on a soft copy display, and then the same images were also reproduced in hard copy. But the hard copy versions were transformed to a number of different mixed adaptation transforms, ranging from a transform that's completely adapted to the display white point to a transform that's completely adapted to the ambient white point. And contrary to Gorzinski's results, Kato found that observers most preferred the 60% adapted to the display version. And actually, among the least preferred was the 100% adapted to the display. So obviously, there's a lot of differences in how these experiments were conducted. And this tells us that there's quite a few factors that are really important in determining an observer's mixed adapted state. So let's quickly go over what those may or may not be. So again, in the case of an observer viewing content on a screen in a lit environment, so obviously the display brightness, white point, its size, how it's calibrated, can have a possible effect on the observer's adapted state. The stimulus type, what kind of stimulus they're viewing, is it solid color, is it images, are they reading a PDF or something? Aspects of observer perception, we all sort of have variance in how we adapt chromatically to things. Their field of view, how much each stimulus is taking up their field of view and where in their field of view the achromatic stimuli are located, and their gaze persistence. So that's like the temporal aspect of the conversation. Are they staring at the TV for a while? Are they staring out the window and then they're looking at the TV, etc. And finally, the ambient light source chromaticity and brightness obviously could possibly have an effect on where the observer's mixed adapted state is adapting to. So keeping these things in mind, there's obviously a lot of variables, possibly too many variables to account for in a single experiment and build a model that accounts for all of them. So basically, the thinking behind our experiment design was that we should create something that we can vary as many of these factors as possible, and outside of that, just try and replicate the real-world viewing scenario of viewing a mobile display in a varying environment as closely as possible while still maintaining experimental control. So an experiment was designed in which observers were presented a series of images under SMPTE HDTV standard mastering conditions, and they were asked to memorize certain simple aspects of the color appearance of these images, like the achromatic areas and the certain memory colors were suggested. And then the environmental conditions would be shifted, and observers would be asked to adjust the images back to what they remembered. So obviously this is a difficult user task, memorizing the color appearance of images and then somehow adjusting them. So we made it slightly easier for observers by just giving them a one-dimensional white balance control. And this white balance control is modeled based on the hypothesis that observers would be adapted to some von Creese-based mixed adapted state between the display and ambient white point. So we have that relation here on the bottom right. It's basically a simple von Creese transform in which the adapting stimulus is some weighted ratio between the display and ambient white point. So moving forward, this is important because all of the results of the experiment will be presented in terms of this D factor here, meaning degree of adaptation, and the way the equation is laid out, basically D equals 1 would indicate an observer is completely adapted to the display white point, and D equals 0 would be they're completely adapted to whatever ambient white point is present in the room. So a few important things to note. 3D LUTs were used to execute the mixed adaptation transforms while observers were adjusting. And this was done so that the transforms could be executed in real time on the lab machine. But the trade-off is that there was a discretized amount of adjustments that observers could make, so it wasn't continuous. But the steps were close to just noticeable difference. So it basically just limited the granularity we could have in results. Also important to note was that originally observers were adjusting some given D float value, but we had to change that. We had to normalize it by the color difference between the display and ambient white point, because for different ambient conditions, basically the control scheme would each step would have a massively different color difference between, say, the 10,000K condition and the 2200K condition. You could see the cyan dot is a lot closer to the intersection point, D65, versus the red dot. So the trade-off here, it provided observer familiarity with the controls, but it obviously changed the amount of response granularity observers could have for the different conditions. And I think that's about all I had to say about that. We spoke about the amount of possible factors that could be involved. We obviously varied the ambient illumination chromaticity because this is sort of the main thing that we're looking at. We also varied ambient illumination brightness between a couple levels. We varied image content, which we'll go over in a second. And we varied starting image color balance. So this typically takes a bit more explanation, but it's based on the known phenomena in the method of limits and the method of adjustments in psychophysics, where observers, when they approach a limit from either side of the limit, their actual psychophysical limit is more likely to equal the average of their responses coming from either side rather than one or the other. And this is also known to happen in the method of adjustments, so we decided to also go with that method. So the first image that we chose to show was an achromatic gray patch, and this was just to identify if there was a difference in observer mixed adapted states between adapting to images and adapting to solid color stimuli. Next, we chose an image of a man to test. You may have seen this man at this conference. I know that he's here. But this image was chosen based on its achromatic content and also the large amount of skin tone. And finally, we chose an image of food, as natural foods are often a fairly good memory color, also for its large amount of achromatic content. So ultimately, the experiment was conducted at the Dynamic Visual Adaptation Lab at the Munsell Color Science Center at RIT. And this location was chosen because it's equipped with 14 DMX controllable LED panels that we could just loop into the experiment testbed and basically within the experimental cadence automatically be adjusting the environmental conditions, which was really fun to work with. And then also through the testbed we would be sending instructions to the Shogun Flame portable display that we were using, and images obviously, and taking observer responses. Yeah, so that was our experiment setup. Without further ado, we'll just get to the results. So the main question on the far left here is, are observers adapting to the surround chromaticity in the environment, and how much? We found that on average, observers were about 70% adapted to the display white point, and the remainder adapted to the ambient white point. This obviously varied for the 10,000 K condition, likely because the smaller color difference between the display white point and 10,000 K versus the other two conditions. And by the way, this all of our variance was determined using ANOVA tests, and the error bars are 95% confidence error bars, so that's sort of how we determined something was a significant variance or not. We also found that there was a significant variance between the two brightness conditions. Given that we had a 100 nit display, the 5 nit SMPTE standard mastering condition varied quite significantly from the other brightness condition we tested, which is the OSHA standard for office environment illumination. There was an average of 20% mixed adaptation ratio difference between those two, which is fairly significant. And finally, we found that there was a significant variance between the images that were shown and the solid color stimulus. So this is an important factor in the sort of application side of things that I mentioned in an adaptive color management application. If, say, some large-scale mobile device distributor was implementing such a transform and it was supposed to be applied to solid color stimulus like application GUIs and things like that, and also images at the same time, the same transform, obviously there would be some variance in how observers would adapt to those two conditions. Prior to the experiment, we conducted a gamut test to verify that image areas were staying, for the large part, in gamut after the chromatic adaptation transforms were applied. So obviously, if you're adjusting the white point of the image, you're also adjusting all the other colors of the image proportionally, and if there's any colors of the image that would be close to the gamut boundary, they would almost instantly be pushed out of gamut. So you might have noticed in the man image, the man was wearing a very bright red hat, so obviously this was problematic. And there were a small number of observers who noted that in the post-experiment survey, they noted that they used the red hat as a reference, so this was sort of problematic in the results. But anyway, this image that I've shown here is the food image adapted to the recommended transform for the 2200K condition. And you can see that there's a fair amount of image content that was pushed out of gamut. So looking at the application again, if this transform was to be applied, you would sort of be trading the color appearance deficit of being off white point for the color appearance deficit of losing like image content out of gamut. So a half solution in color management is sort of not a solution, and if it's causing other problems, then it's probably just not worth doing. So anyone who would implement this would have to consider and have enough gamut headroom to avoid this problem. Since I have time, I have a few other method analysis type things, so I'll address them before maybe someone else comes up and addresses them. So the hypothesis of the von Kreis mixed adaptation transform. So this sort of forced observers to be adjusting the white point of images along a single straight line vector in UV space. And in the post-experiment survey, we sort of aimed to identify if anyone had issues with this by asking if they felt the controls given to them were ample enough for recreating their memorized version of the image. And there were a few observers who stated that that they weren't, by adjusting along the line we gave them, they weren't able to reproduce their achromatic preference. So, so it would be possibly interesting to conduct the experiment again with some sort of other degree of adaptation function to test for. And also another interesting thing that we noted was some observers stated that when they were first shown the images, the image appearance was not exactly how they think they would have color corrected it originally. So when they were adjusting the images, they sort of felt pulled by their preference of what they wanted the images to look like when making the adjustments. So this is interesting because it adds another layer of confusion to the memory task. So observers are not only influenced by their memorized interpretation of the images, but also their color correction preference. So that was interesting to me, at least. So moving forward, what's the goal? I guess the goal is to be able to take your content to the Renaissance Fair or possibly to a red room of some sort and have the images look exactly the same. So what would need to be done for this to become a reality? So the first thing, in my opinion, to do would be to fit the data to some sort of function. Obviously, the von Kreis degree of adaptation function would be, a von Kreis model would be the greater chromatic adaptation model, but either this could be fit to a pre-existing degree of adaptation model or one that incorporates the factors that were varied in this case. And then that would need to be taken and put into a larger color appearance context because, like I said, a half solution in color management is not really a solution. So if you're only accounting for mixed chromatic adaptation in this sense, then you're only doing half the work. Most groups that are concerned with this area are more concerned with luminance adaptation and contrast and things like that. So the model that's fit to the data would need to be incorporated with some greater color appearance model pre-existing again, or possibly one that's built around this viewing scenario. And the final thing that I think I would like to see in the future in this topic is just testing more data points, essentially. So testing, say, a greater ambient brightness level to see if the trends that we saw would continue as we only tested 2 ambient brightness levels, and just seeing the limits in that case. And also considering the direction that this market is going, a test with high dynamic range or wide color gamut content on an appropriate display might also be an interesting extension of the research to see if we still see these effects. Before we get to questions, I'd like to extend some acknowledgements to Mark Fairchild, Ed Giorgiani, and Marcelo Bertamio for assisting in the ideation of this experiment topic, as well as the design of the experiment and helping with deliverables and editing and things like that. I'd also like to thank RIT for providing equipment and spaces for the work. And finally, I'd like to thank the University of Pompeu Fabra and the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program for funding the presentation of this research. So thank you to all of these parties. If we have time and you have questions and you're so bold to bring them up now, please do. If you're more shy, you can contact me personally via email or in person, whatever you want, if we have time, of course.
We do. We have a microphone set up in the middle of the room. If you have a question, please come up. I have one question for you, and you mentioned this in your paper. You didn't mention it here. Your observers, where did they come from, the pool of observers?
Oh, yes. Okay. So my observers were mostly from the Color Science and School of Film and Animation at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which was a fairly good thing in my opinion because this type of experiment task requires a fair bit of nuance, memorizing colors and color correcting, so I was very thankful for that. We had 25 wonderful observers. I meant to mention them, but
so they would be a more qualified observer than just the average person coming in off.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other question I guess I would have, which maybe some people have, is what did you find to be, was there any one factor that stood out greater than the others as far as adaptation?
Well, definitely based on the data, I think the brightness was the greatest factor.
The brightness of the display or the ambient surround?
The ambient brightness. We didn't test varying the display brightness, but that would also be interesting. But most of the time when this type of work is presented, it's in terms of the display ambient brightness ratio. So adjusting them both at the same time. Like I said, it would be interesting to do a high dynamic range display and using realistic ambient conditions to see if that has an effect. But yeah, the brightness stood out definitely, and yeah.
All right. Very good. So we don't have any further questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.